Choice that shrinks. When customization becomes a cage. You open a menu that claims to have everything, yet somehow you keep ordering the same few things, offered to you first, again and again. Your feed feels tailored, but it starts to feel predictable, less like discovery and more like reruns. Even your route home becomes the route the system expects, not the one you choose. That friction is small enough to ignore, but it carries a larger question about dignity. When the world is customized around us, what part of us is being trained, and what part of the world is being removed? Customization becomes a cage when it optimizes for our preferences while quietly reducing our agency, narrowing our shared reality, and distributing harm to people we don't see. Today, I will not claim that personalization is inherently bad, or that we should return to some imagined, unfiltered life. I will also not offer a neat rule for exactly when the line is crossed. What I will do is name the mechanics, how a system designed to serve us can also shape us, constrain us, and separate us, often without clear consent, until choice becomes a thinner and thinner kind of freedom. To speak clearly about customization becoming a cage, we need a few shared terms. Not academic definitions, plain language, grounded in ordinary examples. First, choice. We often treat choice as a count, how many options are available. But choice is more than a menu. Choice includes the ability to see alternatives, to understand the trade-offs, and to revise your decision later without punishment. A person with 10 options that all look the same does not have more meaningful choice than a person with 3 options that represent real differences. And a person who cannot see what was excluded cannot fully consent to what was included. Second, customization and personalization. In everyday speech, we blend them, but there is a helpful distinction. Customization is when you intentionally set something yourself. You choose the settings, you pick the topics, you arrange the order, you decide what more of this means. Personalization is when a system changes the experience for you, based on observed behavior. What you pause on, what you buy, what you skip, what you linger over, what you avoid. Customization centers declared preference. Personalization infers preference. That distinction matters because it takes us directly to consent. Consent is not merely a checkbox or a policy. Consent is informed agreement with the ability to refuse without losing basic access. If a system changes what you see based on what it observes, without making the change legible, then the system may be efficient, while your consent is thin. You may be agreeing to something you cannot perceive. Third, filter bubble. This term is often used as a slogan, but it names a specific pattern. A filter bubble is an environment where the information, people, and perspectives you encounter are systematically narrowed by a selection process, usually automated, so that you repeatedly see what is likely to keep you engaged. It is not merely that you prefer certain things, it is that alternatives are made less visible, less likely, and eventually less imaginable. Fourth, agency. Agency is your capacity to act with understanding and direction. It includes the ability to form preferences, not just satisfy them. Agency is supported by friction sometimes, by moments that interrupt autopilot. Agency often requires that we be exposed to something we did not request, a new idea, an unfamiliar neighbor, a perspective that reorders what we thought we wanted. Now, with those terms, we can separate intent from impact. The intent of personalization is often reasonable. Reduce overload, help you find what you need, save time, match you with relevant content, prevent you from drowning in options. Anyone who has stared at a massive catalog and felt their mind go blank can understand the promise. Let the system narrow it down for me. But the impact can diverge. Narrowing can become neural, the edges of experience can be trimmed away, and the ability to recognize that trimming can fade. It is possible to have a system that feels helpful, that produces comfort and convenience, while still steadily reducing the space where agency grows. A simple example, imagine a music app that learns you like a certain mood, then quietly stops offering songs outside that mood. At first it feels like care, later it feels like repetition. Eventually it becomes a world where you forget you ever listened to anything else. The intent was convenience. The impact is a smaller self. Or consider shopping. If a store's recommendations learn what you tend to buy and then prioritize those items, you might never encounter substitutes, cheaper, more durable, more ethical, or simply different. You cannot choose what you are not allowed to notice. And if the selection is invisible, it is hard to name what you are losing. So when does customization become a cage? Not at the moment it becomes accurate, but at the moment it becomes self-sealing, when the system's predictions reduce the chance of encountering what could change your mind. We also need one more quiet assumption to hold in view. Personalization is rarely just for you. It is for the system as well. It is a way of allocating attention, shaping behavior, and predicting outcomes at scale. And because no system is neutral, the values and incentives inside that allocation matter. When we talk about a cage, we should not imagine bars made of malice. The bars are often made of convenience, metrics, and well-intended automation. The question is not, is this feature evil? The question is, what does the system permit, constrain, and ignore, and who bears the externalities? Customization becomes complicated when we remember what it is made from: data, inference, ranking, and feedback loops. None of these are inherently hostile, but combined and scaled, they produce predictable tensions. One tension is scale versus care. At small scale, a person can personalize with care. If a friend recommends a book, they can also say why. They can notice your mood, your season, your fatigue. They can apologize if they misread you. They can widen your world rather than merely reflect it. A thoughtful librarian can say, I know what you usually read. Here's something adjacent, something that might surprise you. Care includes the ability to explain and the willingness to be corrected. At large scale, personalization must be automated. The system cannot know your reasons, only your behaviors. It cannot gently ask, are you bored, or are you avoiding something difficult? It can only observe that you stopped clicking, and it must decide how to get you clicking again. So it optimizes for measurable proxies: time spent, return visits, completion rates, purchases. The system does not see meaning, it sees signals. This is where good intentions can translate into harm. The system is not rewarded for expanding your agency. It is rewarded for reliably keeping your attention, your engagement, your transactions. When the incentive is retention, difference becomes a risk. Surprise becomes a risk. Shared reality becomes optional because it can be noisy and unpredictable. A second tension is automation versus agency. Automation promises relief, fewer decisions, less effort, fewer wrong turns, and relief is not trivial. Cognitive load is real. Life is full. Many people are exhausted. A system that reduces friction can feel like respect. But agency is not just the absence of friction, it is the presence of meaningful control. When automation chooses for you, when it pre-selects, pre-orders, pre-filters, it may reduce your immediate burden while also reducing your practice of choosing. Over time, the muscle of decision-making can weaken, not because you are incapable, but because the environment trains you to accept what is offered first. Here, the cage is not a locked door. It is a hallway with lights that turn on only in the direction the system prefers. You can still walk elsewhere, in theory, but the path becomes dimmer, harder to find, and eventually not worth the effort. A third tension is metrics versus dignity. Metrics are not wrong, they are incomplete. A system can count what is clicked, watched, bought, shared, or skipped. It can count what is easy to count. Dignity, however, includes things that resist measurement: the capacity to change, the need for privacy, the right to be misunderstood without being permanently categorized, the value of silence, the significance of shared civic facts, the experience of encountering the unfamiliar without being punished for it. When a system equates what you did with who you are, it can flatten a person. One late-night spiral becomes your new identity. One curious search becomes a permanent profile. One impulsive purchase becomes a prediction about your future. This is not just inconvenience. It is a subtle reduction of dignity because it treats the person as a stable target rather than a changing self. Now, we need to name two failure modes explicitly, one at the individual level, one at the system level. Individual level failure mode: preference capture. Preference capture happens when personalization takes a temporary mood, a coping habit, or a narrow interest, and reinforces it until it appears to be the whole person. You click what is easy, the system gives you more of what is easy. You then see fewer opportunities for what is challenging but meaningful, and your future behavior is shaped by what you were shown. This is not merely that you like something, it is that the environment trains your likes. Over time, you may feel that you are choosing, but your choices are being pre-shaped. You become predictable to the system, and then the system becomes predictive of you. That is the cage, not coercion, but the narrowing of possibility. System-level failure mode: monoculture through ranking. When millions of people receive ranked outputs, ranked news, ranked entertainment, ranked products, ranked people, then small differences in ranking matter enormously. The system discovers what performs well according to its metrics and then amplifies it. That amplification causes more people to see it. The seeing causes more engagement. The engagement confirms the ranking. A feedback loop forms, a world where a few formats dominate, a few styles become what works, and creators or participants adapt to the incentives to survive. Even if the catalog is huge, the experience becomes narrow because ranking is a funnel. The system's scale turns a convenience feature into a shaping force. Notice what is subtle here. The system can still claim truthfully that everything is available. The cage does not require removal, it requires obscurity. If the alternative is technically accessible, but practically invisible, the difference is academic. A fourth tension sits underneath all of this: personalization as service versus personalization as control. A service responds to your stated needs with transparency. Control shapes your behavior without requiring your understanding. Many systems contain both. The line between them is often the line between user agency and system optimization. This is why customization can be deceptive. When you are invited to choose themes, interests, or settings, you may feel in control. But beneath that interface, personalization continues to infer and adjust based on behavior. Your explicit choices become one input among many, and not always the most powerful one, and we should name the quiet mechanism that turns helpfulness into enclosure: default. Defaults are not neutral. Defaults are where systems put their values. If the default experience is highly personalized, then opting out becomes a special skill. It requires knowledge, time, and energy. People with more resources can claw back agency. People with fewer resources live inside the defaults. This is how personalization can become an equity issue without anyone ever saying the word. There's also a moral hazard in delegating choice. If the system is wrong, who is responsible? The designer can say, "The model learned from users." The user can say, "The system showed it to me." Responsibility becomes distributed, and in being distributed, it can be dissolved. That dissolution is not a scandal, it is an externality. And if we care about dignity, we have to notice where responsibility goes when it becomes inconvenient. So the paradox is this: personalization promises freedom from overload, but at scale it often produces a narrower corridor of experience, because the system's incentives reward predictability more than growth. The cage is built from optimization pursued without reflection. Customization becomes a cage when it stops being a tool you wield and becomes an environment that shapes what you can imagine choosing. If the tensions we named are real, what follows? Not in a dramatic sense. No apocalypse, no melodrama, but in the steady second-order effects that accumulate while we are busy living our lives. First consequence: reduced exposure to difference. Difference is not merely disagreement. Difference includes unfamiliar tastes, unexpected stories, new skills, alternate ways of solving problems, and people whose lives are not arranged like ours. A personalized environment tends to treat difference as low-probability engagement. If you rarely click on something, the system learns not to show it. Over time, this changes the texture of reality. You encounter fewer surprises that are not already aligned with your profile. The world begins to feel simpler, and that simplicity can feel like peace. But there is a trade-off. Less complexity means fewer opportunities to revise your assumptions. Second consequence: the shrinking of shared reality. Shared reality is the set of experiences and facts that a community can reasonably presume are held in common. Basic news, common reference points, shared cultural touchstones, the sense that we are looking at the same world. Personalization doesn't eliminate shared reality, but it can thin it. When each person's environment is tuned to maximize their engagement, two neighbors can inhabit different informational climates. They may still share a street and a weather pattern, but they lose some of the conversational bridgework that makes mutual recognition possible. Conflict becomes easier, not because people are worse, but because they have fewer shared handles for understanding. Third consequence: isolation disguised as fit. Personalization often promises belonging. We found your people. Sometimes it delivers. But it can also sort us into narrower groups where we feel understood because we are mirrored. Mirroring can be soothing, but it can also become isolating if it reduces contact with those who challenge us with reality. Isolation here is not being alone, it is being surrounded by confirmations. The loneliness is not the absence of people, it is the absence of encounter. Fourth consequence: the outsourcing of taste and judgment. Taste is not a static property. It is cultivated through trial, boredom, surprise, and even disappointment. Judgment is trained by comparing options and feeling consequences. When personalization reduces the need to search and compare, it can also reduce the practice of forming judgment. This has a quiet cost. You may become more dependent on recommendation systems, not because you are incapable, but because the environment has trained your attention to expect pre-sorted answers. In the short term, you save time. In the long term, you may lose some confidence in your own discernment. Fifth consequence, the persistence of harm through feedback loops. When a system learns from behavior, it learns from a world that already contains bias, inequality, and uneven access. If certain communities are historically underrepresented, misrepresented, or treated as low engagement, personalization can reinforce that pattern. This is not always about hostility. It is about optimization. The system improves at serving the majority because that is where the data is dense and the incentives are clear. Meanwhile, smaller communities or less profitable needs become invisible. The system can claim it is data-driven while reproducing the same exclusions. Here is one example of a hidden cost and an excluded stakeholder. Consider a recommendation system that steers most users toward a narrow set of highly popular items, because that improves overall engagement metrics. A small creator or a small vendor or a niche educator becomes an excluded stakeholder. They may not be removed, but they are effectively buried. Their work becomes harder to discover, which means they cannot sustain it, which means the catalog becomes less diverse, which means future users have fewer real choices. The system looks successful, high engagement, satisfied users, while quietly reducing the ecosystem that makes meaningful choice possible. The hidden cost is borne by those who never become visible enough to be recommended. And there is another hidden stakeholder, the person you could have been. This sounds abstract, but it is practical. Each of us is a bundle of possibilities, some of which only emerge through encounter. When an environment repeatedly narrows encounter, it is not only shaping what you see, it is shaping what you become. That is a cost that does not show up on a dashboard. Sixth consequence, consent becomes ambiguous. If personalization is pervasive and opaque, it becomes hard to know what you agreed to. You might think you consented to recommendations, but did you consent to long-term profiling? Did you consent to your behavior being interpreted as identity? Did you consent to your environment being engineered around retention rather than your stated goals? When consent is ambiguous, agency suffers, but because you cannot negotiate with what you cannot see. Seventh consequence, responsibility becomes hard to locate. When a person makes a choice, we can talk about responsibility in a straightforward way. You decided, you own the outcome. When a system shapes options invisibly, the story becomes foggier. The user feels responsible for their choices. The system's operators feel responsible only for providing options. The designers feel responsible only for optimizing metrics. But harm still happens. Misinformation spreads, stereotypes solidify, addictions to novelty intensify, the public conversation fragments, small participants are squeezed out. If responsibility is not located, repair is unlikely. These consequences persist because they are profitable in a broad sense, not always financially, but in the currency of engagement, predictability, and scalable control. Personalization makes the world easier to manage because it turns messy human attention into a legible stream. The trade-off is that legibility is often purchased by reducing complexity. And complexity, though inconvenient, is where much of human dignity lives. The right to be surprising, to change, to encounter difference without being penalized, to inhabit a shared world with others who are not like you. No fear is required to say this. We can simply observe. An environment optimized for keeping us can, without hostility, begin to contain us. So where does that leave us? If personalization is both relief and risk, both service and constraint, it leaves us in the place that modern life often resists: reflection. Not reflection as a mood, but reflection as a practice, the discipline of noticing what we are being trained to attend to and what we are being trained to ignore. The question, when does customization become a cage, is hard because cages are easiest to see from the outside. From the inside, they can feel like fit. They can feel like being understood. They can feel like comfort, and comfort is not shameful. Many people seek personalization because life is already too demanding. There is no honor in overwhelm. But there is also a danger in confusing reduced friction with increased freedom. The clearest sign of a cage is not that you cannot leave, but that leaving becomes unthinkable. Not that alternatives are forbidden, but that they are no longer present enough to be desired. So we can hold a few questions, not as a checklist, not as a program, but as a way of staying awake. What parts of my environment are truly chosen by me, and what parts are inferred about me? Where do I still encounter the unrequested? Difference, surprise, discomfort that teaches rather than degrades. When I say, this is what I like, am I naming a stable preference or a pattern the environment has reinforced? What does this system assume is valuable about me? My growth or my predictability? And because dignity is not private, who pays for my convenience? Who becomes invisible so that my experience can feel seamless? These are not accusations. They are questions about agency and consent inside systems that operate through defaults. We can also admit something that is easy to overlook. A shared reality is not automatic. It is a kind of commons. If personalization turns that commons into individualized streams, the loss is gradual. It is like erosion, no single moment when you can point and say, there, it happened. And because it is gradual, it rarely provokes resistance. It provokes adaptation. We adapt to the narrowed feed. We adapt to the predictable recommendations. We adapt to the feeling that others are strange because we no longer see the ordinary pathways between our lives. There is no neat solution inside a single talk because the issue is not only personal behavior and not only corporate design. It is a relationship between incentives, technology, and human attention. And attention shapes behavior, identity, and outcome. So I will not offer a resolution. I will only name the cost that is easiest to miss. When personalization works perfectly, it can remove the very encounters that would have changed what perfect means. If customization is to remain humane, it has to remain negotiable, legible enough to consent to, reversible enough to revise, broad enough to preserve encounter, and accountable enough that responsibility does not vanish into the system. That is not a command. It is a way of seeing, and sometimes seeing is the only honest place to begin. Care is a constraint, not a sentiment.